When we think of Martin Luther King Jr., it's almost always that hopeful visionary, the man who gave us I Have a Dream. But today, we're going to dig into a different side of him, a side our source material presents as a razor-sharp political analyst. And his warnings about democracy, well, they feel shockingly relevant right now.
And this quote right here, this is the heart of our entire explainer. The source uses this to frame racism not just as some personal failing, but as a systemic threat, something that can rot a free society from the inside out. It's a really urgent and analytical place to start.
So, here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll look at King's core analysis. Then, we're going to connect that directly to modern political language and the power of social media. And finally, we'll get into what our source says is the only real way to defend democracy today. Okay, let's dive in. All right, first up, we're moving way beyond his most famous speech. Our source material really pushes us to look at his deeper, more structural critique of power, because that's where you find his most powerful warnings for us today. So let's just get a quick sense of the timeline. From the mid-50s until his tragic assassination in '68, King was, the moral center of the civil rights movement. But what's really important is how his focus shifted over time, moving from desegregation toward this much broader fight against the economic and structural roots of injustice in America. The source really boils down his thinking to these four core ideas. King saw that racism wasn't just about a few bad apples. It was a system baked into politics, the economy, and the media. And this is absolutely crucial. He predicted that any real progress would trigger a massive reactionary backlash. And that idea of a backlash? Well, it leads us right into our first big then and now comparison. We're about to see how the source connects King's analysis directly to the kind of political rhetoric we hear all the time today. This right here is the key warning. King identified what the source calls the white backlash, a political strategy that weaponizes fear, creates simplistic enemies, and uses disinformation to rally a base, all in response to any kind of social change. And when the source puts these side by side, the parallel is, well, it's pretty direct and unsettling. On the left, you have King's analysis of how politicians exploit resentment. And on the right, the argument that the rise in authoritarian thinking today isn't some accident. It's the result of the exact same kind of calculated strategies King was talking about all those years ago. The main modern example the source points to is Donald Trump. It argues that his presidency made openly racist rhetoric from the highest office feel normal. It describes his use of divisive language as a deliberate political strategy, designed to turn fear into votes and, at the same time, tear down people's faith in democratic institutions. Okay, but this backlash isn't just coming from politicians. The source argues that another critical battleground is the fight for control over our public conversations. And that brings us to the power of platforms and the whole debate over free speech. Obviously King never saw a smartphone, but his analysis of power structures still applies perfectly. The source argues he would have seen the massive, concentrated power that today's tech billionaires have over public speech as just fundamentally undemocratic. And the big contemporary example that's put forward here is Elon Musk. His ownership of a huge social media platform is presented as this new and really dangerous dynamic, where just one person gets to set the terms for a huge chunk of our public debate. So this slide is really interesting because of how it defines this term. The source calls it weaponized free speech. And it's not about being against free speech. It's about a tactic, using that noble ideal as a kind of shield to protect and even amplify hate and disinformation, all while claiming you're just being a neutral defender of speech. And the fallout from that is pretty clear. The source points out that it leads to extremist content getting a huge boost, hate speech starts to feel normal in the public square, and ultimately it chips away at the shared reality that a healthy democracy actually depends on. So after all that pretty grim analysis, what do we do? What's the solution? Well, this last section is all about the response the source thinks is necessary, and it pulls directly from King's own playbook for action. King said these words back in 1967, and man, do they frame the stakes perfectly. The source uses this quote to say we're facing a fundamental choice, and it's a choice that doesn't really allow for a neutral middle ground when you're talking about racism and hate. And this is maybe the most crucial point the source makes. It completely rejects what you might call false balance. It says, look, racism isn't just another opinion to be debated. It is a direct assault on the very idea of democracy. So what does a real democratic response look like? The text gives us 3 clear, actionable steps. First, you have to name the problem for exactly what it is. Second, you have to actively fight back against it everywhere, in politics, in the media, everywhere. And third, you have to build broad, diverse coalitions to defend those democratic values. So at the end of the day, the big takeaway is this. Martin Luther King Jr. shouldn't just be some historical monument we look at once a year. He should be a political benchmark we use right now. His legacy, according to the source, teaches us that you cannot defend freedom if you are not actively and relentlessly fighting racism. And that leaves us with a really powerful final thought. King's last big book was titled with the question, where do we go from here? And what this analysis suggests is that the answer isn't something you'll find in a history book. It's found in the choices that we all make, starting today.